week 17 of the fantasy football season, and he has wide receiver sits this week. The first start, Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. So right now, Nico Collins, last week we didn't see much out of him. 4 catches, 18 yards, a touchdown and a 2-point conversion. This week, a good matchup versus the Titans, though one of the worst pass defenses in the league, and possibly CJ Stroud could return in this one. So right now, Nico Collins still has put up numbers this season without Stroud in the lineup. And we saw it last season all year with Davis Mills. Nico Collins, one of the better wide receivers, I believe, in fantasy football, and one of the more consistent guys, as well as a number 2 receiver for owners. So he's a start this week. Next start, Calvin Ridley of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So Calvin Ridley, I know last week it was garbage time touchdowns, and in the first half he didn't do much, but that could definitely get his confidence up. This week, a good matchup versus the Carolina Panthers. We know this Panther team, one of the worst teams in the league here, if not the worst team. So anyway, Calvin Ridley, a good route runner. He's very familiar with this Panther team, obviously, where he was on the Atlanta Falcons playing the Panthers twice a season a few years ago. So this week, Calvin Ridley, I think, goes out there once again and has a good game. And C.J. Beathard's definitely a possibility. He starts in this one after Trevor Lawrence left as well with the shoulder injury. And Beathard and Ridley were hitting on some passes later in that ball game. So once again, Ridley I would put in the lineup. Like I said, I know it's been an up and down type of year, but after coming off 25 fantasy points in PPR leagues, I think you got to put him out there this week. Next start, George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So George Pickens, him and Mason Rudolph, they had a good rapport last season a little bit. And then last week, Mason Rudolph hit him twice on deep balls. And we know Pickens is a big play receiver. You heard all the negative comments going into week 16, and he went out there and exploded with a monster game, going over 190 yards and finding the end zone twice in that one. So this week at Seattle, I know a better defense, but like I said, Mason Rudolph, he isn't scared to take chances, and I don't really see this Steelers team going to Kenny Pickett, but if they do, I think it's going to be a mistake, and Pickens' stock will fall once again. But this week, after coming off a game like that, it's tough to sit a player with that upside. This week, the next start, T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. So we don't know if Jamar Chase is going to return from the shoulder injury this week. But T. Higgins, the last 2 weeks, he's gone out there and he's putting up numbers. And we've always known T. Higgins is a talented wide receiver. Even with Jake Browning in there, quarterback, he's going out there and making plays, including an 80-yard touchdown in last week's game. So T. Higgins has had performances the last 2 weeks. This week, no doubt about it, a very tough matchup at the Kansas City Chiefs, one of the best pass defenses in the league. But as the number 1 receiver or even a number 2 option in this Bengal offense, I still think he could go out there and have a good game. And remember as well, it's a contract season. Next start, DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. So DJ Moore, I know last week he didn't do anything for the Chicago Bears, where it was pretty much the run game, and Cole Kmet had a big game before he went out with injury. So this week, a better matchup versus the Atlanta Falcons. DJ Moore, one of the better route runners in the league. And it's another home game here for Chicago, where Justin Fields has played better at home this season than he has on the road. So I think Moore, after a bad performance, bounces back, and he's still a wide receiver to have confidence in and start this week. The next start, Adam Thielen of the Carolina Panthers. So Thielen bounced back for one of his better games in a while with 15 fantasy points in PPR league. So this week, a good matchup at the Jacksonville Jaguars that give up tons of fantasy points to wide receivers. And we know this game early and often, most likely, Carolina is going to be trailing and have to throw the football a whole lot. But I know Adam Thielen the last month, besides last week's game, hasn't done much. But if you're in a pinch and need a wideout with a good matchup and the number 1 target on his team, he's a start. In the final start, Demarcus Robinson of the Los Angeles Rams. So Robinson now 3 games in a row where he found the end zone. And last week, 20 points in PPR league. So this week, a good matchup at the New York Giants, where their defense really hasn't stopped anyone all season, giving up top 5 fantasy points to wideouts on the year. So D-Rob is the number 3 receiver in this offense, where he's getting one-on-one coverage or just zone coverage, where he's roaming the middle of the field. He's perfect in this offense with Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, and Matthew Stafford, who's really playing on a high level. Now to the sits, Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. So McLaurin, believe it or not, the last 4 out of 5 games, he's failed to reach double-digit fantasy points. And this week here, a tougher matchup versus San Francisco 49ers, one of the best defenses in the league. I know the Niners give up the 11th most points to receivers on the year, but this week we don't know if it's going to be Sam Howell or Jacoby Brissett. But this week with a tough matchup and with a Commander team that I know is going to have to throw the football a whole lot most likely, this Niner team, it still doesn't matter. Their defense could cover all times of the game, and they make you earn it. So this week, McLaurin, I don't see him doing much. He's a sit. The next sit, Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. I know, obviously, Taylor Heineke back in the starting lineup, and that's a plus over Desmond Ridder for this Atlanta Falcon team and Drake London. But London's been inconsistent all season. This is still a run-first type of team with Bijan Robinson, Tyler Algier, Cordell Patterson has been getting work. And even the tight ends are a necessity as well in this offense. Kyle Pitts, who we saw found the end zone, and Jonnu Smith, who had a few plays in that game. So this week, Drake London, even in a decent matchup with the Bears, he's tough to trust for me. He's a sit. Next sit, Tyler Boyd of the Cincinnati Bengals. So Tyler Boyd, he had 10.90 fantasy points in PPR leagues with 5 catches, 59 yards. But Jamar Chase possibly could return in this ball game for this Cincinnati Bengal team. And this week, a very tough matchup at the Kansas City Chiefs. One of the best defenses in the league against the pass, with Jake Browning not having a great game last week, throwing 3 interceptions. Possibly Chase coming back. And a tough matchups for owners. Tyler Boyd is a sit. The next sit, Jalen Waddle with the Miami Dolphins. I know Waddle, he's had a couple monster games this year, but for the most part, it seems like weekly he's leaving the ball game, and that's exactly what happened versus the Dallas Cowboys in Week 16. First, he got poked in the eye, missed a few drives. Then later on, twisted that shin going out of bounds, and we didn't see him for the remainder of the game. So this week at Baltimore, it's a tough matchup here for Waddle and this Miami Dolphin team. And even Waddle all season, he's been dealing with injuries and nagging injuries on and off. He's a tough guy, no doubt about it, playing through it. But obviously, the numbers haven't really been there. His 2 best games were versus the New York Jets. And this week at a tough Baltimore team, he's a sit, even though we know he's a big play receiver. The next sit, Jackson Smith-Jigba of the Seattle Seahawks. JSN, it's been a decent rookie season for him. A nice number 3 wide receiver for the Seattle offense. A guy in the slot that could run routes, make big plays. And he's definitely a matchup problem. That's why they took him early in the NFL draft last season. But this week here, a tougher matchup versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. JSN, he got banged up a little bit as well towards the end of that one in last week's game with the Tennessee Titans. And him and Geno Smith, they're starting to get on the same page as the season comes to close. But with DK Metcalf and still Tyler Lockett, the 2 top targets in that offense. And like I said, this Steelers defense pretty solid. I think JSN is not really a wide receiver I would have total confidence in this week. And he's a sit. The next sit, Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I know Chris Godwin the last 2 weeks, he's starting to show up and put up fantasy numbers, no doubt about it. But this week, a very tough matchup versus Saints. They give up the 3rd least amount of fantasy points to wideouts on the season. So Godwin in PPR leagues, he's been great the last few weeks, like I mentioned. Last week, 6 catches, 78 yards. Besides the last 2 games, we really haven't seen much out of Godwin. So this week, with a tougher matchup, I don't think we're going to see that much more out of Godwin this week, where his ceiling's pretty much been this season, 13, 15 fantasy points. But with a tougher matchup and Mike Evans being the main man in this offense, he's a sit for me. But if you don't want to sit him, I definitely understand it. In the final sit, Jacoby Myers of the Las Vegas Raiders. So this Raider offense, it's been inconsistent all season. I know Aiden O'Connell's going out there as a rookie and trying his best, no doubt about it. But some weeks it's going to be tough for him. And this week versus the Kansas City Chiefs, I think it's going to be tough once again for Aiden O'Connell. And this whole passing game as a whole to go out there and put up numbers. So Jacoby Myers, it's been a decent first season for him with this Las Vegas Raider team. But this week I don't really see him doing much. And this Raider offense has been hit or miss weekly. 1 week it's putting up 63 points. Next week it's 7-10 points. So this week, in a tough matchup with Kansas City, he's a sit for me. That's wide receiver start sits for Week 17 of the fantasy football season.